Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason. I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and it really is an honor to connect with you. It's been a minute since we've had our last study. We've taken a few weeks off, and now we are ramping back up to take it all the way through the end of 2024, and I'm super excited that you're with us. Now, if you're a regular, man, give me a thumbs up. Let me know that you're there. But if you're new with us, we'd love to have you subscribe to this channel. Not only will you get these particular lessons, you'll also get our Sunday services and those broadcast here at our YouTube channel. You can also find out more about Bridgeway Church at www.bridgeway.tv. And you can find out all of our history and a little bit more about Bridgeway Church. We'd love to have you for a Sunday morning as well. Now, if you are new with us, you might be wondering, why are you calling it 316? What is that coming from? Well, it comes from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. When we first started doing these verse-by-verse studies, we were anchored in on this particular verse that reminds us that all scripture is God-breathed and it's profitable, useful for a variety of things in our lives. It's useful for teaching, for rebuking, for correcting, for training in righteousness, in order that we would be equipped to follow the Lord with our entire lives. And so we love to take a verse-by-verse step through these passages and these books of the Bible. And you'll look back through our kind of library and you'll find that we've done all the letters of the Apostle Paul. We've gone through the prophets of the Old Testament. We've gone through the major prophets, the minor prophets. We've gone through, in this calendar year, we've gone through the book of Matthew, the book of Mark, the book of Luke, and now we find ourselves in the book of John. And I'm super excited about this as we finish up the year. Now, speaking of where we've been for 2024, I'm going to hop over to show you. This was our look for the Gospel of Matthew. Now, just kind of, if you weren't with us for that, this is a real interesting look or a real interesting photo of the Sea of Galilee. And Matthew was coming from the Galilee region. He began following Jesus in Capernaum. And so we leveraged this image to talk through the Gospel of Matthew. When we were in the Gospel of Mark, we leveraged this image as our title image, reminding us of the boat, because church tradition shows that the Gospel of Mark was heavily, heavily influenced by the disciple Peter, that Peter was an influence in Mark's life. And so sometimes people will even account that the Gospel of Mark really is a gospel account from Peter. And then we finished up the Gospel of Luke, and we took this look because of the medicinal aspect of Luke's writings. He was a doctor. We read about that from Paul's letter. And he was well crafted, very intelligent, and we thought the scroll captured a bit of the imagery of his writings. He was very articulate in his writings. And today we find ourselves in the Gospel of John. Now, if you've come across this, you probably wondered, what is the imagery of the eagle in there? Well, I kind of want to point to that. I'll just highlight in the bottom corner, you see the number 5. That's simply because John writes 5 particular contributions to the New Testament. We have the Gospel of John, which we're going through, and then we also have 3 epistles or letters from John. We call them 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And then he is also the author of the book of Revelation, and that closes out the New Testament. So that 5 is indicating the contributions of John. But I want to kind of point to the eagle before we get into our verse by verse. And I'm going to leverage this as part of our kind of context, because whenever we're doing a study of a particular book, we'll try and do some context around it. Why was it written? When was it written? Who wrote it? What do we know about the author? And I'm actually going to grab some passages that you might find to be quite unique, but I think point to the imagery that church history connects with the disciple or apostle John. So I'm going to reach all the way back in the Old Testament here in Numbers chapter 2. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, the Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting, some distance from it, each man under his standard. That would be a flag. That would be the imagery. Each man under his standard with the banners of his family. So each family had banners in the camp of Israel around the tabernacle. And it says in verse 3, on the east toward the sunrise, the divisions of the camp of Judah are to encamp under their standard. And they'll give descriptions of the camps that were within Judah and the other families. But the standard or the imagery that was on the flag or the banner for Judah was a lion. Now, on the south, in verse 10, on the south will be the divisions of the camp of Reuben under their standard. And the vision that, or the imagery that's used there would be of a man's face in some depiction. And once again, there are going to be verses that describe more details of this. I'm giving you just kind of an overview. In verse 17, it says, then the tent of meeting and the camp of the Levites will set out in the middle of the camp. So the Levites were the ones called by the Lord to administer and look after the affairs of the tabernacle and then eventually the temple. We know that Moses is a Levite, Aaron's a Levite. They're coming from that family tribe. So they're at the center around the tabernacle. But then it says in verse 18, on the west will be the divisions of the camp of Ephraim under their standard, which was an ox. And Ephraim is coming from Joseph's line, the brother of the 12 brothers, Joseph. Ephraim is coming from Joseph. And then verse 25, on the north will be the divisions of the camp of Dan under their standard, which was an eagle. So you have a lion, you have a man, you have an ox, and you have an eagle. So let me just kind of show this to you. You had these four particular standards that were on banners surrounding the tabernacle, going all the way back to post-Exodus in the Old Testament. And there's been a number of renderings that have been that people have drawn out and whatnot. So I'm just borrowing one here. So where you would have the tabernacle sitting in the middle of the camp of Israel, you had the tribes that would be surrounding, some to the north, some to the south, some to the east, some to the west. And there would be a front standard or banner in front of them facing the tabernacle. And as you can see, you would have lion, man, ox, and you would have eagle in there, and the Levites would be in the center. Now keep tracking with me because we are headed to John. When you go into the Old Testament, it's an interesting look when you get to the prophet Ezekiel. Israel has rejected the Lord, and we are jumping over a lot of history. We're jumping over Joshua, we're jumping over the Judges, David, Solomon. We're jumping all the way to the prophets and when captivity had happened. And Ezekiel is going to have a vision from the Lord outside of Israel in Babylonian territory, and you're going to see these visuals of man, lion, ox, and eagle. So it says in Ezekiel 1, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. So that's interesting that this passage is coming not in Israel. Daniel will prophesy in Babylonian territory. Ezekiel will prophesy in Babylonian territory. The other prophets are going to prophesy in the territory of Israel. But it says here, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. So when you read the story of Ezekiel, his first vision in chapter 1 is he's going to see a vision from the Lord of angelic being that is going to be moving away from Jerusalem. and specifically moving away from the temple. It's the visual that the glory of the Lord is moving away from the temple because of the judgment that is upon him. But it says in verse 5, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. And he'll go on to depict some things here, but look at this in verse 10. It says their faces looked like this. Of these angelic figures that Ezekiel will see, each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, on the left the face of an ox, and each also had the face of an eagle. So you have these visuals that are very interesting, connected to angelic cherubim, and yet it's also reflective of the banners of Israel. Now, that becomes even more interesting when you jump all the way to the end of the scriptures and you go into the book of Revelation, and John the apostle, John the disciple, the one who we're studying, has a vision of heaven and what is to come in the end. And it says in Revelation 4, and the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here and I will show you what must take place after this. So he's going to get to see and witness heaven, and then God is going to unfold before him what is to happen in the end days. But it says, in the center, around the throne, were 4 living creatures. So typically when we think about heaven, we don't typically visualize the angels, and we don't visualize them in this context. John says, I'm telling you what I saw. 4 living creatures around the throne of God, and they were covered with eyes in front and back. The first living creature was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a face like a man. The fourth was like a flying eagle. So you see these 4 visuals that are connected all the way back to the book of Numbers, when God tells Moses, you're going to have the people encamp, and they're going to encamp about me with banners. And these are the standards that they're going to be marked by. And it's a visual of what is in heaven. It's a visual of angelic around the throne of God. And you see it in Ezekiel, you see it in Revelation. Now, coming to the Gospel of John, when you go into church tradition and you go into church history, the early church fathers ascribed visuals around each of the Gospels. And so we've established over our study from the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, we established that they had different audiences that they wrote to. Now, Matthew wrote specifically to Jewish readers, and that's why he starts off with the genealogy. That really, really mattered to a Jewish audience, that the Messiah came from the line of David, and that there is a connection all the way through the patriarchs of God. And the depiction of Matthew historically from church tradition was one of lion, the lion of the tribe of Judah, that he is the Messiah, the ruler of the Israelites. For Mark, the Gospel of Mark, remember that Mark is writing from Rome, and he's writing to a Roman audience, and he talks specifically about the servant nature of Jesus, and that the gospel of God's servant. Well, the visual that historically throughout church history that was connected to Mark was an ox, because of that servant nature, of that working alongside. Well, then you get to the study that we just finished with the Gospel of Luke, and Luke is writing to Gentile readers, and he writes specifically about the Son of Man. He writes regularly about the Son of Man, and so you have often with the Gospel of Luke the visualization of man connected to this gospel. And then you get to John, and John is more universal in that it's not just to primarily a Jewish audience or primarily to a Gentile audience, it's to both. And John's message is going to be strongly connected to believing in salvation, which we'll explore. But he is going to talk specifically about Jesus as the Son of God, and that's where you get the visual of eagle that throughout church history was assigned to John. So it's an interesting thing when you see something with John and you'll find an eagle, this kind of correlation and connection all the way from Numbers chapter 2. And then you'll see kind of some impressions of it in Ezekiel's vision and then also in Revelation. And so we've chosen the eagle as the connection point for our visual. Now, I said that John's gospel is very rooted in believing. And so jumping to one verse that's near the end of the Gospel of John in chapter 20 says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. So he was not attempting to write everything that occurred and everything that was taught. Sometimes people say, well, what about what's missing? What about what Jesus said or what Jesus did? What is this all? Was there more? And John is unapologetic that it would be impossible to write everything. But he says these that he has written are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so that really is a center point for the Gospel of John. We know that in the Gospel of John, about a third of the Gospel of John is going to occur in the last 8 days of Jesus' life. It is going to be Jesus coming to Jerusalem for the Passover celebration in which he will give his life. And John takes a good chunk of his gospel to depict all that happened in that time frame. One of the things that's different in the Gospel of John to the other writings is that there are no parables. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll have a number of parables. And as Bridgeway, in the summer of 24, we actually did a series entitled The Storyteller, where we walked through a number of the parables of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, you'll find none of them. You'll find no parables. He doesn't specify those. Instead, you'll find in the Gospel of John, you'll find the 7 I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the door. I'm the light of the world. You'll find these I am statements connecting to the I am, the great I am of the Old Testament. So John is very, very rooted in theology. It is a strong theological writing. In John, you're going to have the longest prayer that Jesus prays. That's John 17. You're going to have the shortest verse in all the Bible. Jesus wept. You're going to read about the Lazarus, connection. You're going to read about a number of different things, in the Gospel of John. But one of the things that can't be overlooked is that when you have the name Jesus or Christ, that connection, either using just specifying Jesus or specifying Christ, John is going to point to that more than 70 times. And then when you have the word believe or a variation of believe to believing, belief, you're going to find that almost 100 times in the Gospel of John. So that is really the center point for him. Now, John was the brother to James, so you'll see that in some writings. His father is named Zebedee. James, John, sons of Zebedee. They are fishermen out of the Galilean area, which we'll look at later. I'll show you a map later in our study. And John will become a prolific leader for the early church in the book of Acts. Following the resurrection, following the ascension of Jesus, Peter and John are going to become the two primary faces of the early church. When you read the book of Acts, John is front and center beside Peter until about halfway, and I'm going to show this to you in a second. About halfway in the book of Acts, John will start to become very silent. You won't hear him. You won't see him. And there's an interesting thing that happens in chapter 12, Acts chapter 12, and that is that his John's brother, James, is martyred, and Acts chapter 12 tells us about that. And then in chapter 13, the focus then turns really away from Peter and John and turns primarily towards Paul. You'll still see some visual of Peter and the Jerusalem, connection church, the Jerusalem leadership, I should say. But it will become more centered on Paul. So, let me show you, for instance. So, when you take the book of Acts as a whole, the church following the resurrection, following the ascension, is still in Israel, still in Jerusalem. We read in chapter 8 this, or from chapter 7, 6, and 7, you have the persecution going into chapter 8 of Stephen, and you have the stoning of Stephen. Well, the church is going to flee from Jerusalem, and they're going to head towards Antioch. So you see Antioch just north. Paul, who was Saul of Tarsus, just remember that for just now, Saul of Tarsus is going to follow them north from Israel towards Antioch. You might be familiar in Acts chapter 9, on the way to Damascus. Paul, or this Saul of Tarsus, has an encounter with the Lord. People often call it the Damascus Road experience, where you see Antioch on that map just comes south just a little bit, and that's where you would find Damascus. It's part of Syria. Antioch is in Antioch of Syria. And so Paul is going to continue up that way. But the church, after James is killed in chapter 12, Paul will then begin his missionary journeys with Barnabas. So where you have Antioch, and you have number 1, Paul and Barnabas are going to go from Antioch to number 2, which is Cyprus, and that's where Barnabas was from. That little island is Cyprus. From that, they're going to go up to Galatia, and where you would have number 3, that's where Galatia is. And there's going to be 4 primary towns that they go to. They're going to go to Antioch of Pisidia. They're going to go to Lystra. They're going to go to Derbe. They're going to have ministry there in Galatia. That's where they're going to meet Timothy. They're going to meet a number of people there. That's where Titus is going to be connected to them. They will journey from 3 back to 2 to Cyprus, and then to 1. And then in chapter 14 or chapter 15, they're going to come down. Paul and Barnabas are going to come down to Jerusalem, have a council, the council in Jerusalem. You'll find James, who becomes a leader within the Jerusalem church. And this James is not the brother of John. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus. And then Paul will find himself back up at Antioch. Now you see just here at the bottom, 2 more trips of Paul. The reason that I'm pointing at that is because Paul and Barnabas are going to have a faction. They're going to get divided from one another. Barnabas is just going to go to number 2, to Cyprus, back to his hometown. And then when you read it in Acts 15 and then into Acts 16, Paul is just going to go to his home. So where you see just above Antioch, you see a red circle. That's Tarsus. You'll also find specifically a town in Tarsus, Cilicia or Cilicia, and that's where Paul is from. Paul's going to go up there, and then he's going to tour all the way through Galatia, and then he's going to be led by the Lord in Acts chapter 16 to go to where you see that word P over in Macedonia. That would be Philippi. And then in chapter 17, he's going to go to T, Thessalonica, and Berea. And then he's going to come down to A, Athens. And then he's going to go to Corinth. See the C there in Achaia. Corinth in Greece is Corinth. And then you look all the way across, and you have in Acts chapter 19, Paul's going to go to Ephesus. So the letter that you have there in that map for E, for Ephesus, that's where Ephesus was. It was a port city. And the reason that I'm highlighting that is where eventually John is going to end up. John, historically, according to church tradition will eventually, following his kind of coming into not being seen as much, and the book of Acts starting to highlight Paul more than Peter and John. John will eventually be in Ephesus. Now, Ephesus is also where Timothy is going to get stationed. Timothy will become a leader when you have 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. He is leading within Ephesus. John will be within Ephesus. You see the X beside the E for Ephesus. That would be the island of Patmos. That's where John is going to receive the revelation that we call the book of Revelation. And so it's interesting to see the map of the early church in the book of Acts, how John was part of it, and how John ends up in Ephesus. Now I've never been to Ephesus, but we're taking a team of people to Greece in 2025, and we're going to be in Ephesus. And there's a tomb to John in Ephesus, and I eagerly anticipate that we'll get to be there and see it and have some study there. But the last thing that I would point to is C, just beside Ephesus. That would be Colossians, and that's a town that Paul wrote to, but he never visited there. And I shouldn't say Colossians. The town was called Colossae. He wrote the letter Colossians. So one of the things that, and I'll move off of this to our study in John, one of the things that you'll see predominantly from Antioch over into Galatia, towards where Ephesus is. If you've ever heard of Asia Minor, that's where Ephesus is. That's Turkey, modern day Turkey. That was ancient Asia Minor. Macedonia, those areas were strongly influenced by Gentile thinking, and one of the Gentile predominant thoughts was Gnosticism. Now I'm going to lean on that in a second because John writes about it. Gnosticism was the contention that Jesus could not be fully God and fully human at the same time. That if he was fully God, he could not be fully human. If he was fully human, he could not be fully God. So when we come back to the Gospel of John, and John is in Ephesus, and he is writing somewhere around 85 to 90 AD. He's the last living disciple. He is the last contributor to the scriptures. And he writes the gospel, and he says, "In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning." Now that opening statement is so incredibly strong. The first part is incredibly Jewish. In the beginning connects to Genesis 1. Genesis 1 reminds us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it tells us that the earth was formless, that there was void, that there was darkness upon the waters, and that the Spirit of God hovered upon them. And then God said, "Let there be light." So when John says here, "In the beginning was the Word," he is connecting all the way back to Genesis 1, verse 1, unquestionably. This is very strong Jewish language. So once again, Matthew had written to a Jewish audience, so genealogy really mattered to them, so he begins with the genealogy. Mark, not so much, and so he gets pretty quickly into the work of Christ because of the servant nature that he's writing about. For Luke, he is not writing to a Jewish audience, so the genealogy doesn't matter as much, but he's also going to depict that there are angelic pronouncements that were to come or that came depicting the coming of the Lord. For John, he is reaching theologically to Genesis 1, but then he says, "In the beginning was the Word," and he uses the word logos. Now, for us, if we just read this in the English language, we just come up with Word, and we say, well, what does that really mean? In the beginning was the Word. And if you're in church long enough, you know that this is going to connect to Jesus. You're going to say, "In the beginning was Jesus," because Jesus was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But what does that really mean? So that's where John is writing really strongly here to a Gentile mind. So logos in a Gentile context is really important to consider. In a Gentile context, the concept of logos was more than just an actual word. It was a concept. It was a perception. It was the idea of intellect. It was the idea of thought. It was the idea of existence. So for instance, just track with me here. If you were to have, let's say, a fan, an oscillating fan, you would know that in having that oscillating fan, that there was a designer behind that fan. And there was a designer that had written out a design kind of template, kind of the blueprints of design. Before he ever built, he designed it. It was a thought, and it was a transcribed thought. The existence came by way of thought. This was very much the concept of Greek perception of logos. It was a pre-existing eternal concept. So when John is saying, in the beginning was the Word, he's not just saying like a verbal word. He's saying, in the beginning was original source. In the beginning was pre-existence. In the beginning was the one who began everything. So it is an incredibly deep statement. And when you have the word was, this is a Greek word that carried out the idea of pre-existence. So it's the idea of was, is, will be. Once again, our English language is very limited. So we would read was like a past thing. That would not be accurate to how it was written. How it was written was a pre-existing, the idea that it not only was there, it is here, it will be there. So this is such strong language when he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and he was God. He was with God in the beginning. And you think about John 17. So I'm jumping ahead. I'll come back to John 1. Later in John chapter 17, he'll say, Jesus prays, and now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began, before there was ever let there be light, before there was ever any form of creation. It says pre-existing concept. So that carries over into John's writings here. So he says here in verse 3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it or understood it. Different translations use overcome or understood. Best way to understand this is to reach once again back into Genesis 1, that in the midst of let there be light, there had first been darkness. And he's depicting that darkness cannot stop, not just light, but the nature of God and what he is establishing. And John is connecting all of it, all of creation, to Jesus himself. And so then he's going to get into some stuff that are really important for both a Jewish and a Gentile context. He says, there came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. This is John the Baptist. He is not talking, John the disciple is not talking of himself. He's referring to John the Baptist. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light so that through him all men might believe. So you'll see the concept of believe showing up regularly. But notice that you're going to find this concept of witness. A witness really mattered. That, once again, disciple John, writing initially from the region of Ephesus, in the midst of Gnosticism. We're going to push on that a little more. And he's saying, witness. There's witness that this occurred. so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light, being John the Baptist. He came only as a witness to the light. Witness was a big thing for them. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. Now it's speaking here of Jesus. He, being Jesus, was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Now pause here, just thinking about that last part. Isn't it frustrating when you've done something and people didn't recognize it, or you've provided something and people didn't appreciate it? I mean, think about it to the highest degree. Jesus made everything, pre-existing, and speaks and creates, and then he comes as the origin and author of all life and light, and the world did not recognize him and did not appreciate him. It says in verse 11, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. And that becomes so powerful and important for us all, not only for the Gospel of John, because that is going to be a theme, but also for you and me, because that's as applicable today as it was then. Once again, he was with God, was God, being timeless, was, is, will be. And the writings that John gives still apply to you and me. So what was true about believing in him, the right to become a son or a child of God, still is resident for you and me today. That is also true that we have the capacity of rejecting, not recognizing him, and to push Jesus aside and to not receive him as the Son of God. John is not making any case whatsoever that Jesus is just a good teacher. John will emphatically make the case that Jesus is God and that he comes as the origin and author of all life and all light. And his intention is that you and I might know the Father and be brought into relationship, to a defining relationship as children of God. That is still true to this day as it was when John first wrote it. But once again, you have people that were pushing against this, and John is writing to in an era in which the Gnostics had a very predominant foothold. And when I say Gnostics, remember that the Gnostic teaching, gnosis, the word gnosis comes from this term of knowledge, and the idea was that they taught was that it was impossible for Jesus or anybody to be both fully God and fully human. That he would have had to have been fully human and had the appearance of being God-like, but not God. Maybe God sent or God touched or God blessed, but not God. And that's a big difference between being one thing and being commissioned by one. The flip side is that they would argue that if he was fully God, then he wasn't fully human. And that actually, when you look in church history, that was the prevailing predominant argument, was more so that Jesus was not fully human. So much so that they would argue, he couldn't have bled, he couldn't have died, he couldn't have done these physical things. It was an appearance, but he could not have done what was physical if he was fully God. Now, saying all that to say that concept is what I think triggers the very next statement of John, where it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word, he's already established. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He's establishing the divinity of Jesus. Here, he is establishing the humanity of Jesus. He became flesh and dwelt among us. And there's a witness for this in John the Baptist. And he will also go on to write, John the disciple will write more about witnessing. But you have such a powerful statement here. And the concept of became flesh was that he tabernacled. He became within the tent of a body. Paul would write about these bodies that we have. They're like a tent. The concept that's used here is that when it says he became flesh, he has flesh, like you and me, bones, circulatory system, respiratory system. It's not just that he became fully human for human's sake. It was that God tabernacled with people. Now keep that in mind for just a second, because when you think about Solomon's words, going back to the Old Testament, when Solomon first built the temple, he wrestled with this question. Solomon completed the original temple and then asked this question: will God really dwell on earth? Like, is that really possible? That God, and Solomon's at that time smartest person to ever live, and he's asking the question, will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? Now, pause there for just a second. Because when we go all the way back to the end of Exodus, the tabernacle is built, not the temple. Solomon built the temple. Moses builds the tabernacle, a predecessor for the temple. And it says that the book of Exodus, very last chapter, very end points of Exodus, that the glory of the Lord dwelt and descended upon the tabernacle. What happens right after that? Leviticus chapter 1. And Leviticus chapter 1 carries the idea, okay, now that the tabernacle's been established, the dwelling of God and the presence of God is upon the tabernacle. Leviticus chapter 1 goes into, okay, so if you are going to bring korban, offerings to me, here is how you do it. And you start to get to offerings and bloodshed coming to the tabernacle for propitiation, for forgiveness of sins. It's all picturing towards Christ being the fulfillment, Jesus being the fulfillment of all of these things. That's why when you read this in its completion, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We've seen his glory, and the glory of the one and only who came from the Father. Now let's lean on this, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. This is John the Baptist. John the Baptist testifies concerning him. He cries out saying, this was the one of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. Watch what is written here. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. Such a powerful statement there. Such a powerful statement. So he says that the law came through Moses, and it was unable to complete the job. It did not have the capacity of grace alongside of truth. It could reveal things, but it could not create redemption. The law fell short of the capacity of grace for people. Pardon, that's not what's in play. Grace is a satisfaction of judgment, a satisfaction of the holiness of God. And John writes here that Moses' law brought us to Christ, but still couldn't complete the job. Jesus was full of grace and truth, and his ambition was to make the Father known. Now let's push pause on John, and let me show you something from Paul over with Galatians. Galatians chapter 3, he said the law, that Paul was an expert in the law of Moses, he says the law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. The New King James Version says the law was our tutor. The NIV, which is what I typically use, says the law was put in charge to bring us to Christ. And where you have schoolmaster or tutor or put in charge, you have this Greek word pedagogos. And it's coming from a compound. So where you have pios, that was the idea. You can look through Greek literature. Pios would be used for either a child or a servant. In a hierarchy system, this term could be used of a servant or it could be used of a child. Remember how Jesus takes children and he says, if you don't come as a child, you won't be able to enter the kingdom of God. You must be a servant of one another. It's making a play on pious because it can be used for a child, it can be used for a servant. Well, ago was the idea of to lead. So Paul is simply saying that the law just led us like children. It was a servant leading us like children to Christ. And to make the Father known, well, not entirely, because once again I come back to that grace and truth came through Christ. He is the fulfillment of those things, bringing us to the Father, that you and I, once again, not to become religious, not to become spiritual, not to become weird, but to become children of God. That is the relationship in which we're invited into. That is the heart of the Gospel of John, where he is contending and continually saying that if you believe in Jesus, you shall be saved. But he is not just saying believe Jesus as a historical person. He is saying he was the pre-existing one. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Such a deep theological thing, and yet so practical for you and me that we can be made right with God through Jesus Christ. Now from this, the way chapter 1 is going to complete is he's going to talk about John the Baptist, he's going to talk about the baptism of Jesus, and then he's going to invite the disciples to begin following. I'm going to show you just a couple quick verses. I'll let you read verse by verse the rest of it. But in chapter 1, verse 19, speaking of John the Baptist, this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I'm not the Christ, I'm not the one. It says in verse 26, I baptize with water. John replied, but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who's come after me, the thongs of whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie. And then one more to that, verse 29, the next day John saw Jesus coming toward him and said, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. He still takes away our sin. This is the one I meant when I said a man who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me, pre-existing. So I love that John says he's freely confessed, I'm not the Christ. He's the one we'll read about. I must decrease that he might increase. But then two more passages, the calling of disciples. The next day John was there again with two of his disciples. So two disciples that were following John the Baptist. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, look, the Lamb of God. Verse 40. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon. That's a good brother. And tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John. You'll be called Cephas, which when translated is Peter. So when you come into the New Testament, you hear Simon Peter or Cephas, or you just hear him called Peter. It's like, why so many names? You can come right to this point where Jesus does this defining work for Peter. What will happen is you'll follow this. They'll be going to Galilee. You're going to have the calling of Philip, the calling of Nathanael, and chapter 1 will conclude. Now we're going to pick up in chapter 2. There's going to be the ministry and the work of Jesus going forward. I hope this has served as a good introduction for you to the Gospel of John. And I hope that, as always, that you'll do your own reading and take the study way beyond what I've done. But we've connected this eagle concept to the Apostle John. We've established kind of its network, or so to say, relationship to the other Gospels. looking at from all the way from Numbers chapter 2 into the face of a man, an ox, a lion, now an eagle, and then the strong connection that John makes for the pre-existing divinity of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he'll go on to say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I hope this has been a helpful study for you, and I hope that you'll join me for part 2 as we jump into John chapter 2 next week. God bless you.